The man in the moment Warren Buffett warned America 23 years ago. The fable he used to do it is still being quoted on cable news today, usually by someone arguing about tariffs and usually getting his actual point backwards. The fable is real. 11 pages, published in Fortune magazine in November of 2003, warning that America's trade deficit was selling the country out from under itself. It made Buffett almost impossible to ignore for an entire generation of investors and business students, and almost completely irrelevant to actual policy for the next 20 years. Here's the part that gets left out whenever his name comes up in a tariff debate now. Buffett didn't just diagnose the problem. He proposed a specific fix, and it wasn't a tariff. It was closer to the opposite of one, which is exactly why what's being done in his name today doesn't sit right with him. This is the story of a warning almost everyone agreed with, a fix almost nobody adopted, and a man who spent the last few years watching his own argument get used for something he never signed up for. To understand why Buffett's warning landed the way it did, you have to understand what Warren Buffett was and wasn't in 2003. He wasn't a professional doomsayer. He wasn't running for office. He'd built his entire reputation on patience, buying good businesses and holding them for decades, ignoring the noise, refusing to predict the next crash, famously telling investors the stock market was a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. When a man like that went out of his way to say something was wrong, people listened differently than when a politician said it, because he had almost nothing to gain from saying it, and a great deal of hard-won credibility to lose. By 2003, the US trade deficit, the gap between what America bought from the rest of the world and what it sold back, had crossed 4% of the entire economy, roughly $417 billion that year alone, and growing almost without interruption for 2 decades through Republican administrations and Democratic ones, regardless of who held the White House. Buffett had been uneasy about it for far longer than 2003. He later said he'd first started worrying out loud about America's mounting trade imbalances as far back as 1987, which cuts both ways. It shows he'd been consistent for over 15 years, and it also meant the country had already survived a decade and a half of him being uneasy about it, giving skeptics an easy rebuttal ready to go before he even opened his mouth again. This time, though, he backed the worry with something harder to wave off. For nearly 72 years of his life, he had never once purchased a foreign currency. Now, through Berkshire Hathaway, he started buying several, all at once, a direct dollar-denominated bet that the US currency itself was heading for trouble. Then he wrote down exactly why for everyone else to read. The essay ran that November under a headline that didn't leave much room for interpretation. America's trade deficit was, in his words, selling the nation out from under itself. To explain how, he skipped the jargon and told a fable instead. Picture 2 islands, identical in every way, called Thriftville and Squanderville. Thriftville's residents work a little harder than they need to and export the surplus. Squanderville discovers something appealing. Hand over paper, I owe us, instead of real goods, and you can import food from Thriftville while working less yourself. For a while, Squanderville feels like it's winning, consuming more than it produces and letting somebody else pick up the tab. But the I owe us pile up. Eventually, Thriftville stops trusting the paper and starts cashing it in instead, buying up Squanderville's land, its buildings, its productive capacity, piece by piece, until an island that once belonged entirely to its own people ends up owned, acre by acre, by someone else. The people who inherit that arrangement don't get a vote in it. They're simply born owing. That, Buffett argued, was America, and the bill wouldn't come due for the generation running it up. It would come due for their kids. There was one more detail that made the timing almost cinematic, and it's the detail that sets up everything that happens next in this story. 5 days before Buffett's essay hit newsstands, the World Trade Organization had ruled against President George W. Bush on a completely different piece of trade policy: the tariffs he'd placed on imported steel back in March of 2002. The WTO called them illegal, authorized over $2 billion in retaliatory sanctions, and effectively forced Bush's hand. 3 weeks after Buffett's essay ran, Bush rescinded the tariffs entirely, a reversal that made front pages nationwide. So for one strange month, 2 completely different answers to the same question were colliding in public at the same time. Buffett was arguing for a market-based, non-punitive fix that never singled out one country. Bush had just spent 21 months running the opposite experiment, and it had just collapsed under international pressure at a cost estimated around 200,000 American manufacturing jobs, more than the entire domestic steel industry employed in the first place. Buffett's essay never mentioned the steel tariffs by name. It didn't need to. The White House was living proof in real time of exactly the kind of fight his plan was designed to help the country avoid. The reception. Here's where this story splits from the usual lone genius, mocked and vindicated formula. Nobody laughed at Warren Buffett. There was no debate stage heckling, no late-night comedy bit, no cable news panel rolling their eyes. Economists across the political spectrum largely agreed the underlying math was sound. A country cannot indefinitely consume more than it produces without eventually paying a price of some kind. Buffett's essay was widely read, widely discussed, and widely praised as one of the clearest, most accessible explanations of the trade deficit ever written for a general audience. Business schools taught it. Financial journalists quoted it for years afterward. It became, in a sense, the standard layman's introduction to the entire concept of a current account deficit. And then, almost nothing happened. Buffett hadn't just diagnosed the problem. He'd proposed a specific fix, and it wasn't a tariff. He called it import certificates. The mechanics were elegant, at least on paper. Every American exporter would earn a certificate for every dollar of goods they shipped overseas. Importers, in turn, would be legally required to hold an equal value of those certificates before they could bring foreign goods into the country. Exporters could sell their certificates to importers who needed them, creating an open market. Because the total number of certificates in circulation would only grow as fast as exports did, the system would force imports and exports to balance automatically without a single new tax, without a single government official picking which countries or industries won and lost. It was, in a real sense, the opposite of a tariff. A tariff picks a number and taxes everyone who crosses that line, country by country, product by product, often as a blunt political weapon. Buffett's plan let the market find its own equilibrium, with the only constraint being that the country, in aggregate, couldn't spend more abroad than it earned abroad. It went nowhere. Politically, it was awkward, hard to explain in a 30-second soundbite. Opposed by import-heavy industries who benefited from cheap foreign goods, unclaimed by either political party as a signature issue. Free market conservatives disliked the idea of a new federal certificate system. Import-dependent industries lobbied against it directly. And without a natural political constituency demanding it, both parties let it die in the same news cycle that praised the essay that introduced it. The diagnosis was celebrated. The remedy was shelved within months. It didn't stay entirely theoretical, though. 3 years later, in 2006, two U.S. senators, Byron Dorgan of North Dakota and Russ Feingold of Wisconsin, took Buffett's idea and turned it into an actual bill. They called it the Balanced Trade Restoration Act, and it did almost exactly what Buffett had proposed. Import certificates, tradable, tied directly to export value, a legislative attempt to force the country's books back into balance by law. It went to committee, and it stayed there. No floor vote, no real momentum, no administration push to get it moving. It sat on the desk of a government that had, 3 years earlier, watched one of the most respected businessmen in the country lay out exactly why this mattered. The same government that had just lived through its own very public, very expensive tariff experiment, and had every reason to be looking for something better. And it died the same way the original proposal had, on George W. Bush's watch, without ever forcing anyone in power to go on record voting for or against it. Nobody blocked it in a dramatic, headline-grabbing way. That would be too simple, and it wouldn't be honest to pretend otherwise. It just never became anyone's priority, which, in its own quiet way, might be the more damning outcome. Not a fight that was lost, but a fight that never happened at all. And the deficit kept growing anyway, year after year, administration after administration, completely indifferent to how correct or how ignored Warren Buffett had been. By 2005, just 2 years after the warning, the trade deficit had climbed from $417 billion to over $700 billion. The 2008 financial crisis knocked it down temporarily, Americans buying less because Americans suddenly had less. But as soon as the economy recovered, so did the imbalance, climbing right back toward its old trajectory as if the crisis had never happened. The manufacturing towns that used to run the export side of this equation kept shrinking. Whole categories of goods that America used to make, consumer electronics, heavy machinery, textiles, and eventually even basic pharmaceutical ingredients that hospitals depend on, shifted almost entirely to being imported. And it wasn't only factories closing. It was Squanderville's land being bought quite literally exactly the way Buffett's fable predicted. Iconic American companies changed foreign hands in deals that would have seemed unthinkable a generation earlier. A Belgian brewer buying an all-American beer company, a Chinese conglomerate acquiring the country's largest pork producer, foreign sovereign wealth funds and pension funds steadily accumulating stakes in American office towers, farmland, and infrastructure. None of it was illegal. None of it was even unusual by the rules of the system. It was simply the IOUs coming home to be cashed, one acquisition at a time, exactly as the fable described. Foreign ownership of U.S. government debt climbed as well. Trillions of dollars in treasury bonds held by foreign governments and foreign investors, representing claims on future American tax revenue that Buffett had warned would only grow heavier the longer the deficit went unaddressed. The country wasn't losing a war or suffering a natural disaster. It was simply continuing to do, calmly and legally, exactly what Buffett said Squanderville would keep doing until somebody made it stop. Today, the number Buffett was alarmed about in 2003 isn't $417 billion. It is well over $1 trillion a year. Total foreign holdings of U.S. assets accumulated over decades of these deficits now run into the tens of trillions of dollars. A scale that would have been almost unimaginable to the readers who first opened that issue of Fortune magazine in November 2003. And the debate Buffett tried to settle with a fable about two islands has become one of the loudest, angriest arguments in American politics. Tariffs, trade wars, reshoring, made in America. All of it tracing back, one way or another, to the same imbalance he was pointing at more than 2 decades ago. Fast forward, politicians on both sides now regularly invoke his name. Economists cite his essay and testimony before Congress. Financial commentators dust off the Squanderville fable every time a new round of tariffs makes headlines, treating it as though the man who wrote it had personally signed off on whatever policy is currently being debated. He hasn't. And what he's actually said about it on the record isn't what most of the people quoting him seem to think. Buffett warned us. Nobody listened. And now, with tariffs back at the center of American economic policy, he's finally being vindicated. That's the version of this story that gets repeated most often, and it fits the shape of every other genius-ignored narrative perfectly. It's also not quite true. When Buffett has been asked directly, in recent years, about the current wave of tariffs, the very policies people invoke his 2003 warning to justify, his answer hasn't been "I told you so." It's been closer to a warning about the warning. Trade, he has said plainly and repeatedly, should not be used as a weapon. The more prosperous the rest of the world becomes, in his view, the more prosperous America becomes alongside it, not the other way around. And turning trade into a punitive tool risks damaging exactly the kind of mutual prosperity that lifted the country in the first place. He has openly admitted his own 2003 fix, the import certificate plan, was, in his own word, gimmicky. A confession most public figures never make about their own 20-year-old proposals. And at no point has he endorsed blanket tariffs, country-by-country trade penalties, or economic brinkmanship as the answer to the imbalance he identified. The man is regularly cited by name as the intellectual godfather of a trade policy he has never once endorsed. His fable is used in congressional testimony, cable news chyrons, and op-eds to justify a specific set of actions. And the man who wrote the fable keeps declining to sign off on those actions, in public, on the record, whenever he's asked. In other words, the diagnosis was right. The disease, a country consistently consuming more than it produces, financed by selling itself off piece by piece, generation after generation, is real. And by Buffett's own numbers, it has gotten significantly worse, not better, in the 23 years since he named it. But the cure now being sold under his name is not the cure he prescribed, and it isn't a cure he has ever agreed to. He named the disease with striking precision. He did not, in the end, endorse the medicine currently being forced down the country's throat in his name, using his own words as the label on the bottle, which leaves the country in a strange position 23 years later. Everyone agrees on the warning. Almost nobody agrees on what to do about it. Politicians who disagree on almost everything else can both quote the same fable and reach opposite conclusions about what it demands. And the man who wrote the whole thing down, in 11 pages about 2 imaginary islands, is still here. One of the most famous people in the world, entirely capable of speaking for himself, watching an argument happen in his name that he never quite signed up for, and correcting the record every time someone asks him to. Somewhere out there, Thriftville is still exporting, Squanderville is still buying, and the bill Warren Buffett said someone would eventually have to pay is still coming due, whether anyone's watching or not. $1 trillion year at a time. Maybe that's the real lesson buried in this story, the one that doesn't fit neatly on a chyron. Being right about a problem and being right about the solution are 2 entirely different achievements. Warren Buffett managed the first one in 1987 and again more forcefully in 2003, with a clarity almost nobody in American public life has matched since. Whether anyone manages the second one, whether the country ever actually balances its books instead of just arguing about who should, is a story that 23 years later still doesn't have an ending.